Steel monsters rolled across Europe. Thick armor. Heavy guns. Relentless advance. German tanks were supposed to be unstoppable. They crushed defenses. They broke armies. They decided battles before they even began. Allied soldiers feared them. Infantry scattered. Anti-tank guns failed. Hope disappeared under grinding tracks. Then the sound came. Not from the ground. From the sky. A deep roar. Fast. Violent. Unforgiving. Pilots dove straight into fire. Engines screamed. Rockets ignited. Explosions ripped through columns of steel. Tanks burned. Crews fled. Formations collapsed. What once ruled the battlefield became targets. Hunted. Helpless. German tank crews learned a new terror. Not enemy armor. Not artillery. But a thunderbolt falling from the clouds. This is the story of the rocket-firing aircraft that changed the balance of power forever. By 1943, Europe was locked in total war. Cities burned. Front lines shifted by miles and by bodies. On the ground, one weapon defined victory. The tank. German armored divisions had rewritten the rules of warfare. Speed. Coordination. Shock. Blitzkrieg had smashed through Poland, France, and deep into the Soviet Union. Steel columns moved faster than resistance could form. Panzer crews believed in their machines. And for good reason. Their tanks were heavily armored. Well armed. Designed to dominate open ground and crush anything in their path. Allied commanders knew the truth. Stopping German armor was costly. Often impossible. Mines slowed them. Guns damaged them. But rarely stopped them. Every advance left wrecked defenses behind. Every breakthrough deepened the fear. Yet the battlefield was changing. Above the smoke and chaos, Allied air power was growing stronger. Faster aircraft. Heavier payloads. New ideas. One aircraft, in particular, stood apart. Large. Brutal. Built to survive. It would not challenge tanks head-on. It would hunt them from above. And when it arrived, the balance of the war began to shift. German tanks were more than weapons. They were symbols. Symbols of dominance. Of control. Of inevitability. Across Europe, their reputation grew with every campaign. Poland fell. France collapsed. Entire armies were outmaneuvered and overwhelmed. At the center of it all were armored formations moving with terrifying precision. Panzer units did not advance slowly. They surged forward. They punched holes. They never waited. The Panzer IV formed the backbone. Reliable. Versatile. Deadly. Then came the Panther. Low profile. Sloped armor. A gun that could destroy enemy tanks at long range. And finally, the Tiger. Heavy. Thickly armored. Armed with an 88mm cannon that inspired fear the moment it fired. Allied crews knew the numbers. They knew the odds. And they knew how quickly those odds turned against them. Conventional anti-tank guns struggled. Shots bounced. Barrels overheated. Crews were wiped out before they could reload. Infantry tactics offered little comfort. Close-range attacks were suicidal. One mistake meant death. Entire units stalled when German armor appeared on the horizon. Orders slowed. Momentum vanished. German tank crews felt nearly untouchable. Protected by steel. Supported by doctrine. Confident in their machines. They moved in daylight. They advanced across open ground. They gathered in columns without fear. Because for a long time, nothing could stop them. The battlefield belonged to armor. And German armor ruled it. But dominance breeds predictability. And predictability creates vulnerability. The problem was never courage. It was reach. The Allies needed a weapon that could strike where armor was weakest. Not from the front. Not from the sides. But from above. And soon, that weakness would be exposed in fire, smoke, and thunder. The answer did not come from the ground. It came from the air. From an aircraft that looked almost oversized for war. Wide wings. A massive engine. A fuselage built like a flying fortress. Its name was the P-47 Thunderbolt. Pilots simply called it the Jug. At first glance, it did not look elegant. It was not sleek. It was not lightweight. But it was powerful. At its heart was the largest piston engine ever fitted to a fighter aircraft. An 18-cylinder radial engine. Producing raw, relentless force. This engine gave the Thunderbolt speed. It gave it altitude. And most importantly, it gave it survivability. The P-47 could absorb punishment that would tear other aircraft apart. Shell holes in wings. Shrapnel in the fuselage. Damaged control surfaces. And it would still bring its pilot home. This mattered. Because the missions ahead were brutal. Thunderbolt pilots were not asked to duel enemy fighters at high altitude. They were sent low. Very low. Down into a sky filled with flak. Down toward machine gun fire. Down toward exploding shells. The P-47 thrived there. Its thick armor protected the pilot. Its heavy structure resisted damage. Its sheer mass allowed it to dive faster than almost anything in the sky. In a dive, the Thunderbolt became unstoppable. It screamed toward the earth like a falling hammer. Pilots trusted it. They depended on it. Unlike lighter fighters, the P-47 could carry enormous loads. Bombs. Fuel tanks. And soon, something far more devastating. It was not designed as a tank killer. Not originally. But war demands adaptation. And the Thunderbolt had room to evolve. As Allied commanders searched for ways to break German armored dominance, the Jug stood ready. Strong enough to carry new weapons. Fast enough to strike and escape. Tough enough to survive repeated attacks. What began as a high-altitude escort fighter was transforming. The battlefield below needed a hunter. A predator that could strike armored columns wherever they moved. The Thunderbolt was about to become that weapon. And when it did, the rules of ground warfare would never be the same. Firepower alone was not enough. Speed was not enough. Durability was not enough. To break German armor, the Thunderbolt needed something more. It needed a weapon designed for destruction. That weapon came in the form of rockets. Unguided. Crude by modern standards. But terrifyingly effective. Mounted beneath the P-47's wings were high-explosive rockets capable of ripping through steel. Not with precision. But with overwhelming force. Each Thunderbolt could carry a full load of these weapons. 8 rockets. Enough to turn armored columns into burning wreckage. The idea was simple. Hit the tanks before they could fight back. Thunderbolt pilots would spot German armor moving along roads, hiding near forests, or massing behind the front lines. Then they would climb. Turn. And dive. The dive was everything. Engines roared. The aircraft accelerated. Gravity became a weapon. At high speed, the pilot lined up the target. A column of tanks. Fuel trucks. Half-tracks. Then the rockets fired. A sudden flash. A violent trail of smoke. A split second of silence. Then impact. Explosions tore through the ground. Shockwaves lifted vehicles. Armor cracked. Tracks snapped. Even when a tank was not destroyed outright, it was often crippled. Immobile. Abandoned. Useless. German formations broke apart under these attacks. Vehicles scattered. Crews bailed out. Orders dissolved into chaos. For tank crews, there was no warning. No time to react. The attack came from above. From a direction they could not armor against. Machine guns opened fire desperately. Anti-aircraft guns tried to track diving aircraft. But the Thunderbolt was already gone. Pulling up at the last moment. Climbing back into the clouds. Again and again, the attacks continued. Roads became death traps. Convoys moved slower. Columns avoided open ground. German commanders quickly realized the danger. Armored units could no longer move freely. Every movement risked annihilation from the air. The battlefield was no longer just horizontal. It had become vertical. Steel monsters that once ruled the land were now exposed. Vulnerable. Hunted. The rockets of the Thunderbolt did not just destroy tanks. They shattered confidence. They disrupted operations. They changed how the war was fought. German armor was still powerful. Still dangerous. But it was no longer safe. And that changed everything. Destroying tanks was not random. It was methodical. Calculated. Deadly. Thunderbolt pilots did not simply fly low and fire blindly. They were trained to hunt. The first step was observation. Long before rockets were fired, pilots searched the battlefield from above. Roads. Rail lines. Tree lines. Villages. German armor left signs. Tracks in the mud. Dust clouds on dry roads. Movement where none should exist. Once a target was found, the attack began to take shape. Pilots climbed to gain altitude. Not too high. Just enough. Altitude meant speed. Speed meant survival. The dive followed. Steep. Fast. Relentless. As the Thunderbolt dropped, enemy fire intensified. Flak bursts filled the air. Tracer rounds reached upward. But the P-47 kept coming. At the right moment, the pilot adjusted his aim. Not at the turret. Not at the thickest armor. But near the tank. Around it. Rockets did not need a perfect hit. Their explosions did the work. A near miss could flip a vehicle. Break tracks. Jam turrets. Kill engines. Often, a single pass was enough. If not, the Thunderbolt returned. Again. And again. Pilots coordinated with ground forces whenever possible. Tank movements were reported. Targets marked. Attack windows identified. This cooperation turned air power into a precision weapon. And rockets were only part of the attack. After the rockets came the guns. 8 heavy machine guns mounted in the wings unleashed a storm of fire. Fuel trucks erupted. Half-tracks shredded. Infantry scattered. The goal was not always destruction. Sometimes it was paralysis. Stop the column. Block the road. Create chaos. A single destroyed vehicle could halt an entire armored advance. German units quickly learned this lesson. Movement slowed. Routes changed. Camouflage increased. But nothing offered complete protection. Forests trapped vehicles. Roads exposed them. Open fields invited attack. There was no safe choice. Thunderbolt pilots exploited this uncertainty. They struck where armor gathered. They waited where tanks would pass. The sky became an extension of the battlefield. German armor was still dangerous. Still lethal. But now it was constantly under threat. Watched. Tracked. Targeted. The Thunderbolt did not just attack tanks. It denied them freedom. And in war, that loss can be fatal. The damage went far beyond burned metal. It reached the mind. German soldiers began to fear the sky. Where once they watched the horizon, they now listened upward. For engines. For the distant roar that meant death was coming. Tank crews no longer felt invincible. Steel walls no longer felt thick enough. Armor no longer felt safe. The Thunderbolt changed how they moved. Armored units avoided daylight. Columns broke apart. Vehicles hid beneath trees and camouflage nets. Roads became dangerous. Open ground became deadly. Movement slowed to a crawl. Crews waited. Listened. Hoped the sound would pass them by. Often, it did not. Reports from the front spoke of panic. Of sudden attacks without warning. Of explosions that came before orders could be given. Some tanks were never destroyed. They were abandoned. Crews fled burning vehicles. Left engines running. Left weapons behind. Morale suffered. Confidence disappeared. German commanders issued new instructions. Disperse vehicles. Hide whenever possible. Move only when necessary. But this caution had a cost. Armored formations lost their speed. Their coordination. Their shock value. Blitzkrieg depended on momentum. And momentum was gone. Even when Thunderbolts did not score direct hits, their presence was enough. Attacks were delayed. Advances halted. Plans rewritten. The fear of air attack became constant. Exhausting. Crippling. For soldiers inside armored vehicles, there was no escape. No counterattack. No warning. Only the hope that today, the Thunderbolts would find another target. The battlefield had changed its rules. German armor was still powerful. Still capable of destruction. But it was no longer confident. And in war, fear can be as devastating as firepower. The reality was more complex. German tanks did not suddenly become worthless machines. They still fought. They still destroyed enemy armor. They still held ground. Rockets were not perfect weapons. They were unguided. Inaccurate. Dependent on pilot skill and conditions. A direct hit on a tank was rare. Very rare. Most rockets missed. Some exploded too early. Others buried themselves in the ground. Many tanks survived attacks without a single scratch. Historians later discovered something important. A large number of tanks reported as destroyed from the air were actually abandoned. Disabled. Or simply left behind. But that did not make the Thunderbolt ineffective. Because war is not only about destruction. It is about pressure. Disruption. Control. Thunderbolts forced German armor to slow down. To hide. To move at night. They broke supply lines. Destroyed fuel trucks. Shattered coordination. A tank without fuel is useless. A tank without support is vulnerable. A tank forced to wait is a failure. The Thunderbolt did not need to destroy every vehicle. It only needed to deny freedom of movement. And it succeeded. German armor still mattered. Still demanded respect. But it could no longer operate as it once had. The battlefield had become hostile in every direction. Ahead. To the sides. And above. The myth was not that German tanks became useless overnight. The truth was more devastating. They became cautious. Predictable. Restricted. And in modern war, that loss of flexibility can decide everything. When the war moved forward, the Thunderbolt moved with it. Across France. Across Belgium. Across Germany itself. Every advance was covered from the air. The lessons learned were impossible to ignore. Air power was no longer separate from the battlefield. It was part of it. The Thunderbolt proved that aircraft could shape ground combat directly. Not just by bombing cities, but by hunting targets in real time. Future wars would remember this. Fighter bombers became standard. Close air support became doctrine. Coordination between pilots and ground forces became essential. The P-47 showed what was possible. It showed that speed could replace armor. That altitude could replace cover. That fear could replace firepower. Other aircraft followed its path. Improved designs. More accurate weapons. Deadlier systems. But the foundation had already been laid. The Thunderbolt's legacy was not measured only in destroyed vehicles. It was measured in battles won. In advances protected. In soldiers saved. By the end of the war, the P-47 had become one of the most successful ground attack aircraft in history. Trusted. Respected. Feared. It was not elegant. It was not subtle. It was effective. And long after the last rockets were fired, the lesson remained clear. Control the sky. And the ground will follow. In the beginning, the battlefield belonged to steel. To armor. To tracks cutting through the earth. German tanks ruled by force and fear. They advanced in daylight. They gathered without hesitation. They believed nothing could stop them. Then the sky answered. Not with speeches. Not with warnings. But with thunder. The Thunderbolt did not ask permission. It did not wait for perfect conditions. It struck where armor was weakest. From above. Rockets fell. Engines roared. Columns burned. What once moved freely now hid. What once dominated now hesitated. What once inspired fear now felt it. The tanks were still powerful. Still dangerous. But power without freedom is fragile. The P-47 Thunderbolt proved a simple truth of modern war. The battlefield is not just won on the ground. It is won by those who control the space above it. Steel may rule the land. But the sky decides its fate. And when the Thunderbolts came screaming down from the clouds, the age of untouchable tanks came to an end.